Banning the Bible. The English authorities were okay with power moving from the Pope to the nobility, but they didn't want it moving anywhere else. When the peasants got all revolting in 1381, Wycliffe's ideas were blamed. "You see," said the powers that be, "this is what happens when people start reading the Bible for themselves. Anarchy, rebellion, general revoltingness." So, in 1407, Thomas Arundel, Archbishop of Canterbury, banned the making and reading of Wycliffe Bibles, without the approval of the Church, so Wycliffite Bibles. And since there was no way the Church was ever going to give approval, this was a big fat no to the translation of the Scriptures into English. The 1407 ban was a stop-and-search law for Scriptures. It allowed the English authorities to search and confiscate any heretical books. No other part of Europe went to such lengths to stop people getting hold of the Bible in their own language. Vernacular translations were not exactly encouraged elsewhere, but they were never made illegal. Yet in England, translating the Bible was to remain illegal for another 150 years. They also tried to clamp down on Wycliffe's followers. They called them lollards, a word that was supposed to imitate the muttering, mumbling sound of a group of lay people stumbling their way through the Bible. Lollards were believed to be threats to the social order, and these fears were confirmed in 1414 when the prominent Lollard Sir John Oldcastle marched on London with a badly thought-out plan to establish some kind of commonwealth. He and his army were easily defeated, and Oldcastle was publicly executed. The sentence was heresy and insurrection. In the psyche of the English nobility, the one necessarily led to the other. But Lollardry proved amazingly resilient. Driven underground, it survived and thrived among traders and merchants and the professional classes. Small groups of Lollards continued to meet in secret. They appointed their own leaders, allowed lay people to preach and to officiate at the Eucharist, and they read from their Bibles. And nor were these the outcasts and the poor. These were people from prosperous farming areas such as East Anglia, the Chilterns and the Cotswolds. These were the kinds of people that the authorities really feared, people with cash. The spread of these groups is reflected in the number of Lollard Bibles that still survive. Over 250 manuscripts of Lollard Bibles survive to this day, mostly copies of all part of the New Testament. More Wycliffite Bibles survive than any other form of medieval literature. Considering that these are only what was left after the Purge, there must have been thousands of these things produced. Because one pope is never enough. In 1377, after some 70 years in France, the latest pope, Gregory XI, returned to Rome for a bit. The state of the city so appalled him that he died a year later. By now, the cardinals were largely French, so they wanted to go home at this point. But the Romans, having now got them back, weren't going to let them go. They forced the cardinals to stay and choose a new pope, an Italian pope. So the cardinals quickly elected Pope Urban VI, and the moment the Romans' backs were turned, the cardinals legged it back to Avignon, where they deposed Urban and appointed a French replacement, Clement VII. This was not, as we've seen, the first time there were two rival popes, but it was the first time that they each had their own cities and courts, and each pope had support from various European rulers. But this time there were two real popes, two proper primates. This situation continued for 30 years, with Avignon and Rome each electing their own popes. To try to solve the problem, a council was convened at Pisa in 1409. Neither of the current popes attended, which was not a good omen. The council decided to simplify things by dismissing both of the present popes and electing a new one. Genius! Well, it would have been, were it not that both the Avignon Pope and the Roman Pope refused to step down. And the new Pope wasn't going to step down either. So now, there were three popes. Scandal in Bohemia. Meanwhile, outside the confines of the papal palaces, the world was changing. Wycliffe's ideas had already escaped the university. They'd flown over the seas, in fact carried like a virus. In 1382, Anne, Princess of Bohemia, married King Richard II of England, and there was a sudden influx of Bohemian students coming to Oxford, a bit like the 60s. There they came into contact with Wycliffe's ideas, which they took back to Prague, along with other souvenirs such as their "My son went to Oxford and all I got was this lousy tabard" clothing, and their "My other heretics are Lollards" bumper stickers. The ideas were taken up by the Dean of the Philosophical Society in Prague's newly established university. His name was Jan Hus, and he was a fiery Czech preacher. Not literally, obviously, although actually, given his fate. Bohemia was a part of the Holy Roman Empire, but it had a strong sense of its own identity. Hus did something incredibly radical. He offered communicants both the bread and the wine, something that had not been done for centuries. He was relying solely on the Bible for his inspiration. Czechs loved these ideas. When one of the three rival popes tried to excommunicate him, there was a riot. In 1411, one of the two original popes declared a crusade against the other one, and tried to recruit backers for this by offering free forgiveness of sins for anyone who put money in the pot. When the decree arrived in Prague, Hus condemned both the Pope and the decree and had it burnt in the street. Under Hus' arrest. Meanwhile, attempts were being made to sort out the embarrassing multi-pope situation. A council was called at Constance in 1414. It took 5 years, but it eventually sorted out the mess. The idea was that all three current popes would make way for one new one. The most recent pope was persuaded to move downstairs, as it were, and became the Cardinal Bishop of Tusculum. The fact that he'd been found guilty of heresy, simony, piracy, murder, and other unmentionable stuff didn't seem to count against him. The Roman Pope agreed to step down, providing that he could be a kind of deputy pope in the future. Everyone agreed. He was already 90, so it wasn't going to be a permanent position. And it wasn't. He died in 1417. Only the Avignon Pope wouldn't play ball. He refused to resign and declared that he was the real Pope, so there, and he was taking his bat and ball and leaving. He retreated to a remote castle in Spain, where he spent 6 years complaining, before dying in 1423. The council appointed a new pope. But, fed up with dealing with the mess created by such overweening authority in the hands of power-hungry individuals, the council went all Eastern Orthodox. It declared that in the future, church councils, not the pope, were to be the final authority on ecclesiastical matters. To facilitate this, regular councils were to be called every few years. The pope was not the final master. And the council promptly showed that it could be just as spiteful and duplicitous as any pope. Wycliffe was declared a heretic and condemned to be burnt at the stake. The trouble was that he was already dead, so the council ordered that he should be dug up and burnt, and then thrown into a river. This was okay, but everyone agreed it would be so much better if they actually had somebody actually alive to condemn. So they offered Jan Hus safe passage to come to discuss the unrest in Bohemia. He was given a promise of safe conduct by the Holy Roman Emperor, Sigismund, but the council ignored that and had Hus arrested and thrown into a dungeon. Sigismund was furious, but the council told him that promises didn't count if they were given to a heretic. Hus was put on trial, denied a defence counsel, kept chained up at night and half-starved. In 1415, he was burned at the stake. His death turned him into a martyr in Bohemia. A mob, led by a radical preacher called Jan Zalewski, went to the city hall and drew 13 Catholics from an upper window to their deaths. Throwing people out of windows, or defenestration to use a technical term, was to become a habit. They went on to wreck churches and monasteries. It led to decades of civil war in Bohemia. The Bohemian army managed to hold off such much stronger forces from elsewhere in the empire through inventing especially the tank, fortified wagons, covered with sheets of iron with slits through which those inside could fire out. These were pulled by horses. Poor horses. The council might have decided it was the supreme authority, but the new pope, Martin V, managed to avoid letting it meet and actually do anything. He was supposed to call one of the shiny new regular councils in 1423, which he did, but an outbreak of plague allowed him to dismiss it before it could do any harm. And when he died in 1431, his successor Eugenius IV tried to play for time. But this time the council sought the German emperor's support to make sure that not only would a council meet, but that it would actually have the power to do something. It did meet, and it did do something. It reunified the Eastern and Western Church. Reunification. By 1423, the Byzantine cause was almost hopeless. The Turks were overwhelmingly powerful, and the once magnificent empire of Byzantium now consisted of Constantinople, a bit of land in southern Greece, and some allotments near Thessalonica. The Pope recognized that the situation was critical. He invited the Byzantines to a council, and so, on the 8th of February 1438, Emperor John VIII of Byzantium and Joseph II, Patriarch of the Byzantine Church, met with the Pope in Ferrara, accompanied by 20 bishops and some 700 priests, monks and lay officials. It was the biggest show of ecumenical unity for 1,000 years. The meeting is recorded in what is the nearest the Renaissance came to as official summit photograph. The painter Benozzo Gozzoli recorded the delegates as characters in the Procession of the Magi on the walls of the Medici Chapel in Florence. It was a historic occasion. It was also fabulously expensive. The Pope had a hole knocked in the wall of the palace to allow him to ride his horse right up to the throne, because he thought that being seen with his feet on the ground might diminish his prestige. This sheer expense of the occasion soon started to drain the papal coffers, and the whole affair had to be moved to Florence as a cost-cutting exercise. After much negotiation, a decree of reunion was agreed. The East was in no position to negotiate, but the Council did make some concessions, most notably around our old chum the Filioque clause. The East accepted it, and in return, the West did not require the East to use it. So East and West were remarried, and bells rang out across the city. But when the Greek negotiators returned to Constantinople, they were met with the same antipathy as before. Even those who had attended the council agreed that they had sold their faith. And all the most reliable Byzantine opinion polls clearly showed that by now most Byzantines would rather be conquered by the Turks than by the Pope. In any case, the West proved itself unable to deliver on its side of the bargain. When in 1443 it finally did get round to sending an army to save Constantinople, they only got as far as Bulgaria, where they were slaughtered by the Muslims. Faced with such anger and, as they thought, ingratitude, many prominent Byzantine clerics and scholars packed their bags, headed to the harbour, and got onto a boat back to Italy. Their number included Bessarion, Metropolitan of Nicaea, who had led the pro-union clergy at the council. In 1450, even the Patriarch of Constantinople himself, Gregory Melissenos, fled to Rome. Along with these high-profile emigrants, thousands of Byzantine scholars, intellectuals, tradesmen and craftsmen found jobs in the West as teachers and tutors. They brought with them hardly anything in the way of money or possessions, but they had skills that to the Westerners seemed magical in particular, so in particular they could read and write classical Greek. The Byzantines had developed a system of further education where anyone over the age of 14 would study the works of the ancient Greek poets, historians, dramatists and philosophers. Any educated Greek in the imperial service, therefore, would have undergone this education. They settled in many Italian cities, sometimes in significant numbers. By the late 1470s, the Greek population of Venice, for example, stood at around 4,000. They were even given a wing of the Church of San Biagio in which to worship in their own language. The end of the East. On the 28th of May, 1453, there was an ecumenical service in Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. For the first time in, ever, Orthodox and Catholic Christians in the city, including the Emperor, met together, prayed and shared the Mass. And after that, they all went out to die. The Turks had besieged the city for many months. There had been a heroic resistance effort, led by the Emperor, but now, on the evening of 29th of May, 1453, Ottoman forces under Sultan Mehmet I finally conquered Constantinople. Constantine XI, the last emperor of Byzantium, was lost among the fighters in the streets. His body was never found. The Eastern Empire, the great empire of Byzantium, was finished. There was a day of terror and looting, with bodies piled in the streets, men and women killed, assaulted or taken into slavery. At sundown, the 21-year-old Mehmet entered the church of Hagia Sophia and watched while an imam stood in the pulpit and proclaimed, "There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his messenger." 1,000 years after the church had been built by Justinian, it had become a mosque. The news was received with horror in the West. Pope Nicholas V declared another crusade, diverting funds from various art projects, creating new taxation, even selling off books and art to fund it. But no one else shared his enthusiasm. The French and the English were embroiled in the 100 Years' War, which by now, rather surprisingly, had reached year 116. And anyway, the last time a crusading army had faced the Turks, they had been well and truly beaten. It was not, of course, the end of Christianity in the city of Constantine. The church survived. Mehmet appointed a monk, Gennadius, to be patriarch. But the church was never as influential again. and in later years the post changed hands largely on the basis of who paid the most money. Christians were heavily taxed, forced to wear special clothing, and forbidden to evangelize others. They were not allowed to marry Muslims. And the effect was that Christians in the West simply forgot. They forgot there had once been a mighty empire in the East, a Roman Empire that had stood for 1,000 years after the one in the West had declined and fallen. They forgot that Christianity had flourished in the cities of Syria and North Africa and Persia and Palestine long before it had even started in Britain and France and Spain. They forgot that Christianity had been born in Jerusalem, taken its first tottering steps on the streets of Antioch and Alexandria, grown to maturity in Constantinople and Nicaea and Chalcedon. Christianity became what many people around the world still assume it to be, a religion of the West.